The ranch sat heavy under winter's hand, silent except for the long groan of the barn beams and the steady rhythm of hooves stamping in their stalls to keep warm. No birds sang. Even the sky seemed tired, slumped low and gray, burdened with snow not yet ready to fall. Lena Kincaid rose before the sun most days, boots already pulled on by the time the rooster made his pointless noise. Her breath fogged in the lantern light as she passed through the kitchen, bare shelves, ash-cooled stove, a single mug still damp from last night's tea. She moved quiet as water, careful not to wake her father. He hadn't spoken to her in 3 days. Not out of anger, but from something worse, grief turned inward, old and stubborn. Since the fire last spring took part of the east fence and, with it, the last of his savings, he'd been living like a ghost in his own house. Grunts had replaced greetings. Work orders came with a nod or a lifted brow. And in the silence between them, Lena had grown into a woman without anyone noticing. She carried the hay to the barn as she always did, shoulders squared against the wind. The snow crunched beneath her boots, deep enough to chill her calves. When she opened the barn doors, the horses lifted their heads, steam curling from their nostrils like smoke signals in the cold. But it wasn't just horses that stirred in the dark that morning. At first, she thought it was the sack of grain someone had left too close to the wall. Then it shifted. A man, curled into himself near the back stall, half buried in straw and saddle blankets. His hat had slipped low over his face, and his coat looked like it had weathered 2 winters too many. One hand clutched something to his chest, torn canvas, maybe a satchel, and the other hung limp at his side, blue at the fingertips. Lena didn't scream. She rarely did anything loud. Instead, she stepped back slow, like drawing breath might wake him, and lifted her lantern to get a better look. His boots were worn near through. His cheekbones sharp beneath weeks of unshaven stubble. Whoever he wasn't dangerous. Not now. He looked more like something the wind had carried in and forgotten. The horses didn't spook. That told her something. She crouched beside him, pressing 2 fingers against his throat. Faint pulse. Alive, but barely. She considered waking her father, but the man's presence, this mystery, felt like hers alone. Like the universe had dropped a secret into her lap and asked her to keep it warm. She set the lantern near his head and reached for the satchel. Not to steal, just to know. A folded paper peeked from the side. Torn at the edges, water-stained. She opened it carefully, her fingers already aching from the cold. To my intended bride, it began. Her heart stilled a beat. She read on, lips parting. The letter was written in a firm, careful hand. He explained who he was. Micah Quinn, age 25, a carpenter from back east. He'd answered an advertisement. He'd sent money. He'd waited for word. When none came, he took what he had and traveled west anyway. I ain't a man of fine words, the letter said, but I got 2 good hands, a quiet nature, and I don't scare easy. I'm coming, if you'll still have me. There was no return address. No response. Lena folded the letter back, gently as if it were glass. She looked down at the man again. Micah. A name now. A story. A soul wrapped in snow and silence. She dragged the spare horse blanket from the tack room and tucked it around him. She checked his hands again, still cold, but color returning. She couldn't leave him. Not like this. So she fetched water in a tin cup, warmed it over a flame, and trickled it against his lips. He stirred, murmuring low. She couldn't make out the words, but they didn't sound like fear. She whispered, "You're safe here," before she even realized she was speaking. The sky lightened through the slats in the barn walls. She had only minutes before her father came out to inspect the stock. He always started with the barn. He'd see Micah, and he wouldn't ask questions. He'd call the sheriff, or worse. She touched Micah's shoulder. "You need to wake." He blinked slowly, eyes gray as slate under thawing lashes. His voice rasped. "I didn't mean to trespass. You're freezing." Was warmer than the wind. His head lolled back down. Lena's hand hovered near his cheek, unsure whether to help or retreat. In the end, she left him where he lay, covered him better, and moved quickly to finish the chores before her father noticed anything out of place. By the time she entered the kitchen again, her father was at the table, buttering stale bread with the focus of a man used to hunger. He didn't look up. "Feed's low," she said. "Need to go into town come Tuesday." He grunted. "I'll take the wagon." He didn't argue. He hadn't in months. Whatever dreams he once had of shielding her from hardship had died the same day her wedding was called off. The banker's son who promised her a soft life in Billings changed his mind when he saw her driving cattle one spring morning, dust on her dress and sweat at her brow. He wanted lace, not leather. Her father never spoke of it again, but the lines on his face deepened, as if her rejection had stained his pride too. That night, she snuck food to the barn. Micah sat upright now, his coat tight around his ribs, steam rising from the soup she handed him. He thanked her with a nod, said little, but his eyes followed her with quiet recognition. She noticed the way he moved, like a man taught to take up less space than he needs. The way he chewed slow, as if savoring something rare. And when she asked, gently, what happened, he didn't launch into a tale. Just said, "The bride changed her mind. The letter never reached her. Or maybe it did." He wasn't bitter. Not exactly. More tired than anything. "I walked a while," he said. "Figured I'd find work somewhere. Guess I found your barn instead." "It's not mine," she said. "Not really." He looked around. "Feels like someone's kept it alive." She didn't answer. Just pulled her coat tighter and sat across from him on the hay, both listening to the wind rattle the doors. By the third day, he was splitting logs without being asked, fixing the broken hinge on the chicken coop, saying little, but always watching with soft, assessing eyes. Her father noticed. "Who's the man with the dog eyes?" he asked, half joking, half wary. "Just someone cold," Lena said. "I let him stay a night or two." "He planning to leave?" She looked out the window, where Micah stood elbow-deep in water, cleaning the trough. "Don't think he's planning much at all. He just helps." Her father grunted again. Less like disapproval this time, more like resignation. By the seventh day, Micah had moved from the barn to the small bunkhouse behind the stables. Lena hadn't offered, it had simply happened, the way snow melts when touched by enough kindness. He made no claim to belonging, didn't overstep, didn't charm. He just stayed, steady as sunrise. And that was the strangest part of all. Lena had known men who tried to win her like a game of cards. Others who scorned her for not being soft enough. But Micah asked nothing. He accepted silence like it was sacred. He noticed her without needing to say it. One night, she found him reading the letter again, creases deep from folding. He didn't see her watching. The wind outside had stilled. The stove glowed low. And in that stillness, something settled in Lena's chest that felt not like fear, but like the beginning of warmth. She stepped back from the doorway and left him to his memories. But as she lay in bed, she whispered his name into the dark, just to hear it soften on her tongue. Micah. A man who came without promise. Who stayed without pride. Who looked at her, not like a girl left behind, but like a woman waiting to be seen. The snow thickened outside, wrapping the ranch in silence once more. But this silence felt different now. Not the silence of absence. The silence of something beginning. The days passed in a hush of frost and old routines. Lena rose before dawn, fed the horses, hauled the kindling, salted the path between house and barn, all while the wind pressed against the world like a hand trying to wipe it clean. The only new thing, quiet, steady, and unspoken, was the man who moved through her father's land like a breath too light to stir dust. Micah did not ask to stay. He never once pleaded, bargained, or made mention of what he might deserve. He simply woke, stood, and began to mend what was broken. Without waiting for permission. He repaired the crooked fence behind the north pasture, the one the cattle always leaned on. Replaced the rusted nails with ones he'd straightened by the forge. When a hinge squealed on the feed-room door, he oiled it without fanfare. His hands, thick-knuckled and red from cold, worked like he owed the land something. Lena watched from the shadows more often than she admitted. She wasn't used to men who moved like they belonged but never claimed. Who could split wood with quiet grace, then wash the dinner bowls like it meant something. Each evening, she brought him stew or whatever scraps she could sneak from her father's plate. He never asked for more. He always waited until she'd handed it over before he touched the bowl, as if to accept her help too eagerly would cheapen it. "I'll work," he said one evening, voice hushed under the stars. "You don't owe me a thing, but I'll keep earning the nothing I've got." That made her blink. He didn't smile, didn't explain. Just tucked into the stew like a man who knew better than to take warmth for granted. Her father, Caleb Kincaid, wasn't blind. He noticed the man working the land. He noticed his daughter watching. But he said little. That was his way. Words were things to be rationed, like coffee or bullets. He simply frowned deeper, shook his head when Micah passed too near the porch, and drank his evening coffee in brittle silence. By the 7th day, the bunkhouse had been swept clean. By the 9th, Micah was sleeping there with a wool blanket Lena had left on the cot, pretending it was Granny Myrtle's doing. "Kind of her," Micah had said, folding the edge of the quilt beneath his calloused fingers. "She's always dropping things off," Lena replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "Used to say loneliness is a curse best broken in pairs." Micah only nodded, as though the truth in that wasn't meant to be touched too hard. Each night, Lena returned to the house with her cheeks flushed from more than cold. She found herself moving slower through chores, choosing paths that led her near the bunkhouse, just to see the light in his window. He never called out to her, never asked her to stay, but she could feel the way his gaze lingered when she turned away, like he was memorizing her without trespass. One morning, as the sun cracked through the clouds in pink seams, Lena found her father waiting on the porch. He had his coat buttoned all the way up, hands tucked into his sides like he was bracing for something. "This man," he said, not looking at her. "You're doing—" "He was freezing," she said. "That don't answer my question. I fed him. Let him stay." He turned then, his face carved hard by wind and years of sorrow. "What are you looking for in a man like that?" "I'm not looking," she said. "He's just here." Caleb snorted. "Folks don't just show up. They come with plans, with wants. Mark me, he's hiding something." Lena bristled. "Or maybe he's just tired. Same as us." Her father narrowed his eyes, studying her like a stranger who spoke a language he didn't want to learn. Then he turned and walked inside. Lena stood on the porch a long while, hands clenched in her sleeves. When she turned, she saw Micah down by the woodpile, splitting logs with a calm rhythm that didn't break even once during their conversation. Later that day, she joined him near the smokehouse. They worked in silence, passing cuts of meat to hang and salt. "You always work this hard?" she asked. He shrugged. "Don't know how to stop." She didn't smile, but her voice softened. "That letter, your bride never answered." He paused. "Not from pain, but consideration." "No. And I don't blame her. I'm not what you call promising. A carpenter without a shop. No land. No fine speech. Just motion. You came anyway." He nodded. "Didn't feel right to stop. Somewhere between Indiana and here, it stopped being about the woman and started being about the journey." "That sounds like something a preacher might say." He gave the smallest grin. "Maybe I'm just making sense of a fool's errand." They went back to their work. But the air between them felt different now. Not charged, something gentler. Like a bridge half-built. That night, a storm rolled in sudden and sharp, slamming branches against the roof and sending the cattle into uneasy moans. Lena rushed outside, coat flapping behind her like a flag. Micah met her halfway between barn and porch, lantern in hand. "I'll check the east gate," he said. "I'll get the foal," she replied without pause. They didn't argue. Didn't hesitate. They moved like two people who'd been doing this a long time, even if this was their first real test. Snow slashed sideways. Wind howled down from the hills. Lena found the foal shivering in the corner, legs trembling. She lifted it with a grunt, muscles straining, arms burning. When she staggered toward the barn, the wind nearly took her down. But then Micah was there, coat soaked, eyes wild. He took the foal from her arms without a word, cradled it like something holy, and carried it into the warm straw without stumbling once. She followed him in, breathless. He laid the animal down, covered it in burlap, then turned to her. Snow clung to his lashes. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm not glass," she said, though her knees shook. He reached out, slow, uncertain, and brushed a stray curl from her face. "No, you're not." They stood that way for a breath too long. She could hear her own heart, could see her own reflection in the shine of his eyes. Then she stepped back. The moment passed, but it left something behind. 2 nights later, Granny Myrtle arrived, bundled in wool and perfume that clung like violets. "Came to bring quilt scraps," she said, then eyed Lena over her spectacles. "And to see what kind of handsome mystery man the snow delivered." Micah shook her hand, warm and respectful. Granny smirked. "He's a quiet one," she muttered to Lena when he turned away. "Quiet's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "Because it's the quiet ones you tell your secrets to." Lena didn't reply, just watched Micah kneel by the stove, coaxing flame from damp wood. That night, the ranch slept heavier. The air had softened, as if the land itself knew something had shifted. Lena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind die down. She thought of Micah's hands. Not how they touched, but how they held. The way he lifted things gently even when they were heavy. The way he looked at her, not like a man who saw a future, but like one who saw her. Whole, strong, enough. And that, more than charm or promises, was what made her breath catch. Not that he stayed, but that he never once asked to. The snow had crusted so hard that it cracked beneath each step like bone. January had carved the land hollow, stripping bark from trees and kindness from breath. Every movement required more effort now, horses stiff in the morning, hinges groaning at touch, and Lena's own hands blistered from carrying too many buckets with frozen rope handles. The cold didn't ask permission. It simply entered your bones and stayed. Micah hadn't said much that week, but then again, neither had she. Words, she found, were like firewood, precious, and best saved for the bitterest nights. Still, he was there at every turn. Chopping, hauling, fixing. He moved with quiet purpose, as if repaying a debt no one had asked him to settle. He never crossed lines, never assumed, but his presence had begun to wear a path in her heart, just like his boots had worn one in the snow between bunkhouse and barn. Her father noticed. He didn't need to say so. The silence between them had grown taut, brittle. He'd set his coffee cup down a little harder each morning, his gaze tracking Micah from under the brim of his hat. And Lena, she felt the divide rising like a fence that hadn't been there before. Then came the fire. It began with a single spark, nothing more than a clumsy flick of a lantern as Lena reached for the saddle soap. One moment the barn was still, warm with straw-scented air and the rustle of resting horses. The next, flames danced up the wooden post like fingers looking for something to hold. She shouted, tried to smother it with burlap. But the wind outside had found a crack, fed the flame greedily. It raced along the beam and leapt to the roof as if starved. She ran. Not for the house, but for the bunkhouse. Micah burst out before she even reached the door. His coat barely on, boots unlaced, axe in hand. He didn't ask where. He just ran past her, into the glow. The barn was ablaze in 2 corners, smoke thick as wool. Micah pulled open stalls with his coat sleeve over his mouth. The horses bolted into the cold, wild-eyed and steaming. Lena followed, coughing, dragging hay bales back, kicking open the rear doors. 1 stall remained, the mare with her newborn foal, trembling in the far corner. Micah didn't hesitate. He dropped the axe, vaulted the stall gate, and lifted the foal in his arms like it weighed nothing. The mare followed, whinnying low and frightened, but he moved slow enough not to spook her. The smoke thickened. Flames licked the rafters. Lena's voice broke. "Micah!" He stumbled through the smoke a moment later, eyes red-rimmed, hair singed at the edges, the foal pressed to his chest. He didn't speak. Just walked past her, set the creature gently on the snow, and collapsed to his knees beside it. She dropped beside him. His hands were blistered. The left side of his coat was burned through. The night howled around them. She touched his face. "You should have waited. You didn't." Those words settled into her like hot tea into chilled bones. They didn't return to the house. Not yet. They sat beside the foal until the wind died, until the smoke faded into the black sky and the barn stood scorched but intact. The fire hadn't taken much, but it had nearly taken everything. They moved to the bunkhouse at last, both silent. She fetched ointment and rags. He sat on the cot, elbows on knees, letting her tend his hands. He winced only once. "You're lucky," she said. "No worse than a scald. Feels like worse." She smiled, brief and small. "You saved her. Didn't think about it. Just moved. That's how you are, isn't it? You just move." He looked up then. And something in his face had changed. Softened, sharpened, maybe both. "I move," he said. "But I've never stayed. Not once." She sat back on her heels. "Why not? No one ever gave me a reason to." Lena stood slowly. The bunkhouse seemed smaller suddenly, as if her breath took up more space than before. The oil lamp flickered low on the shelf. The storm had gone still outside, the kind of hush that came before sunrise. Her voice was quiet. "What if someone did?" He didn't answer. She crossed to the stove, stoked the coals. Her hands trembled, but she held them steady. There had never been a moment like this. Not with the banker's son, not with any of the ranch hands who'd passed through. This was no proposal. This was no dream spun by letters or lace. It was survival, wrapped in a kind of sacred knowing. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "But I need you to know something." He turned toward her. She met his gaze and held it. "You make this place feel like it can breathe again." Micah rose. Slow. Measured. His hands, wrapped now, hung at his sides like anchors. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped just short of touching her. "I don't know what I am," he said. "But I know how to stay." Outside, a faint gold line had begun to etch the horizon. "I ain't got family," he added. "Ain't got land. Just these hands and what I've learned. I've never had someone choose me without a reason," she whispered. "Not because they had to. Not because they wanted something." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded slip of paper. The letter. The one meant for a woman who had never written back. He offered it to her. "Burn it." She didn't take it right away. Her fingers hesitated. Then she reached out and closed them around the parchment. She crossed to the stove, opened the firebox, and laid the letter atop the embers. It curled in silence. The edges darkened. The ink bled and vanished. When she turned back, he was still standing, hands open. And she said it, simply. "Marry me." He blinked. "Lena." "Not for romance. Not yet. For something steadier. Something that won't break in winter." Micah stepped closer. He didn't ask if she meant it. Didn't test her resolve. "I'll marry you," he said. "But only if you promise me one thing." She nodded. "Anything. That if I stay, really stay, you'll let me be more than what this land needs." Her throat tightened. "I want you to be whatever you are. Even if I don't understand it yet." He breathed in like a man stepping out into clean air. Then he touched her hand, wrapped in his bandaged one. "Then yes," he said. "Before the sun." Granny Myrtle arrived half an hour later, wrapped in quilts and indignation, muttering about freezing her rear off for lovebirds who didn't know enough to wait till spring. But when she saw their faces, smoke-smeared, wind-bitten, lit from within, she stopped talking. They stood in the clearing near the frozen stream. The sky had begun to bleed lavender and gold. Trees cast long shadows over the snow. The air held that peculiar hush, like the whole world leaned in to listen. Granny held a Bible with cracked leather. Read the words slow and sure. She called them husband and wife before the frost melted on their boots. Lena had no ring. Micah had no vows written. But their eyes never strayed. And that was enough. The fire in the barn had died. The ranch slept. Her father hadn't come out. Not yet. But she imagined he knew. Imagined the crunch of her boots in the snow had told him everything. They didn't wait for approval. Love, she had learned, didn't always come with blessings. Sometimes it came in smoke and silence. Sometimes it came with burnt hands and winter breath. After the words were spoken, Micah bent his head, not to kiss her, but to press his forehead to hers. A moment of stillness, of promise. They walked back to the bunkhouse side by side, their footprints side by side, their shadows stretching long behind them like twin roots just beginning to reach into soil. As they crossed the yard, the front door of the main house creaked open. Her father stepped out. Hat pulled low. Hands in his coat. He didn't speak. Just looked at them, long and heavy. Micah stopped. Lena did not. She met her father's eyes and nodded. Not a plea. Not a dare. Just truth. Her father's gaze drifted to the smokehouse, then to the barn, still scarred but standing. His eyes landed on Micah. He didn't reach for his gun. Didn't spit. He said one word. Boy. Micah lifted his chin. Sir. Her father held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked back inside. The door shut behind him. That was all. But it was enough. That night, as the stars rose hard and bright above the plains, Lena and Micah sat in the doorway of the bunkhouse, their shoulders touching. He held her hand like it was already familiar. She leaned into him, not from weariness, but from choice. They didn't speak. Words had done their work. Now came the part where life had to catch up. She rested her head on his shoulder and listened to the wind sigh through the grass, softer now, as if winter had loosened its grip for just a while. The fire had taken something, but in its ashes they had laid a vow. Before dawn, with nothing but frost and firelight for witness, they had chosen to stay. The morning after the vow tasted like iron and frost. It lay heavy in the air, still and cold, the way breath curls in silence before breaking into speech. Lena awoke not to celebration but to stillness. Her hand, bare and ringless, lay over Micah's chest as he breathed slow beneath the quilt. She watched the rise and fall of him and wondered if marriage always began in such quiet. Not with bells, but with bone-deep steadiness. Micah stirred beneath her touch and offered a small, tired smile. His burned hands, wrapped now in strips of linen and softened with salve, curled gently around hers. I dreamed we were building something, he murmured. We are, she said, voice rough with sleep. But first comes the reckoning. He sat up slowly, wincing slightly, and glanced toward the bunkhouse door. She knew the unspoken thought between them. Her father hadn't said a word after watching their footsteps disappear into the snow. But silence was its own storm, and Lena had lived long enough in its shadow to know how sharp it could break when it finally came. By the time the sun touched the hills with gold, her father was already saddled and walking the pasture fence line like he always did after a long night. A ritual, maybe. Or a way to burn off the thoughts too heavy to carry into the house. Lena found him at the southern edge of the property, where the snow thinned to dry grass and wind etched the earth into hard ridges. He didn't turn when she approached. I'm married, she said simply. I know. His voice held no tremble. It was flat as hammered tin. He didn't take anything, she added. I gave it. All of it. Freely. Caleb Kincaid stood with his arms crossed, gloved hands digging into his sleeves. You think I care about virtue? I think you care about control. That made him turn. The look he gave her wasn't one of anger. It was worse, raw disappointment, laced with something deeper. Fear, maybe. Loss. You think I don't know what you are? He asked. You think I don't see you? I've seen you work yourself into the ground for this land. I've seen every damn man pass you by, 'Cause you're too strong to need him. And now you marry a drifter with nothing but burned hands and quiet eyes, and I'm supposed to just, bless it. Lena held her ground, though her throat ached. You haven't blessed anything in a long time. He stared at her, breathing hard. You think I don't love you, is that it? I think you forgot how. That landed like a blow. He looked away. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Caleb spoke again, voice lower. You know what I see when I look at you? Your mother. That stubborn chin, those hard eyes. And I see the day I buried her in snow just like this. You were screaming in your cradle, and I held you and thought, God took one and left me the other. I don't know what to do with that. Lena's breath caught. I loved her so much, he said. And I was afraid I'd lose you too. So I held on too tight. I made everything about survival. Not joy. Not softness. You shut me out, she whispered. I thought it'd keep you safe. It didn't. A bird passed overhead, its wings catching the early light. Neither of them looked up. I didn't marry him to spite you, she said after a while. I married him because for the first time, someone looked at me like I wasn't just the sum of what I could carry or fix. He saw me, and I didn't have to earn it. Caleb let out a breath like it had been held for years. You love him. I trust him. Maybe that's more important right now. He rubbed a hand across his weathered face. I don't know how to let go. You don't have to let go, she said softly. Just make room. The sun cleared the hills. Light spilled across the land, painting the snow in gold. Caleb turned toward the barn, then toward the house, as if choosing between the past and the future. He said nothing more. Just walked away, toward the house, his steps slow, his shoulders no longer quite so stiff. Lena watched him until he disappeared inside. Later, she found Micah stacking what was left of the unburned firewood. The bandages on his hands were smudged, his brow damp with sweat. She moved to his side, took the log from his grasp, and set it down herself. He doesn't hate you, she said. Micah gave a quiet snort. Feels like he does. He's not used to things changing without his say-so. Micah turned to face her. And you? I've been waiting for change since I learned to ride. He studied her, then leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers again, just like he had on their wedding morning. It wasn't passion that moved them, it was presence. The shared knowing of two people who'd walked through fire and come out scarred, not broken. The day stretched long, filled with chores and sidelong glances. Granny Myrtle came by just before dusk, a kettle of soup in one hand and a box in the other. What's this? Lena asked. Your mother's things, Myrtle said. Been holding on to them for years. Figured now's the right time. Inside the box, a quilt, soft and faded. A brooch in the shape of a sparrow. A letter never finished. And a wedding dress wrapped in tissue yellowed with age. Lena touched it like one might touch memory, carefully, reverently. She would have wanted you to wear it, Myrtle said. I didn't have a church or music, Lena whispered. You had firelight, and a man who would have burned with you. That night, Lena laid the dress across the bed in the bunkhouse. Micah stood at the doorway, watching her. She was beautiful, he said. So was her silence, Lena replied. I think I learned it from her. Micah stepped forward, brushed his fingers across the fabric, then across her arm. We'll fill this place with noise, he promised. With laughter. With hammering. With new stories. Lena turned to him. And if the stories end hard, we build new ones. As the stars lit the sky once more, Lena stepped outside. Snow drifted lazily, no longer cruel. The barn stood dark but not ruined. The house glowed from within, faint light spilling through the windows like an invitation long withheld. She heard footsteps behind her. Her father emerged from the shadows, carrying a small wooden box. He held it out without ceremony. She took it, opened the lid. Inside lay a folded deed. and beneath it, a silver ring that hadn't seen daylight in 2 decades. "It was hers," Caleb said. "And now it's yours. For whatever comes next." Lena's throat closed. She reached forward, not just for the box, but for his hand. He didn't pull away. Micah stepped out to join them, quiet as ever. Caleb's eyes met his. There was no warmth in them, but there was something close. "You stay?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Micah said. "And you mean to do right by her?" "I already am." A long breath. A slow nod. Then Caleb turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind him. Not a welcome, but not a wall. Lena looked at Micah. "That's as close as we'll get." Micah smiled. "Close is enough for now." They stood beneath the stars, 2 figures carved in frost and firelight. No grand promises. No declarations. Just presence. Just promise made real. The reckoning had come. Not in shouts, but in quiet confessions. In the laying down of pride. In the lifting of old grief. And as the wind softened and the land sighed into sleep, Lena felt something stir inside her chest. Not hope, not exactly. Something sturdier. Something that would hold through the storms still to come. The thaw crept in slow, like a prayer whispered by the earth itself. First came the sound, the trickle of water running beneath snowpack, the slow drip of ice slipping from eaves, the soft thud of boots no longer crunching but sinking into thawed mud. Then the scent, damp wood, fresh earth, smoke from a stove that burned more for comfort than survival. Trees that had stood brittle and bare began to swell with promise. And with that promise, Lena found herself changing in ways she hadn't prepared for. The morning she noticed the shift in her body, it was not with fear but with a hush, an inward pause. She sat on the porch swing Micah had built 2 weeks prior, carved by hand, smoothed with care, and she pressed her palm to her belly where a new rhythm had begun. Quiet still, like a knock from the inside. A beginning. She said nothing at first, letting the knowledge bloom inside her like the earliest crocus in snow. Micah sensed it, though. He was like that, tuned to her silences, the shape of her breath. One evening, he came in from mending the gate, dirt smeared across his forearms, sunburnt at the collar. He crouched to unlace his boots, then looked up at her across the hearth. "You've been different," he said. She stirred the stew. "Have I?" "Not in a way that worries me. Just quieter, but more full. Like you're holding something." She looked at him. "Steady." Then set the ladle down. "I think I'm pregnant." Micah didn't move for a long breath. Then he stood, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and knelt in front of her, his hands resting on her knees. "You sure?" "No. But I know." He rested his forehead against her leg. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with awe, not fear. "I never thought I'd be part of something this real." Lena exhaled, her hand finding the curve of his shoulder. "Neither did I." In the days that followed, they worked with a new rhythm. Micah began to build a cradle from leftover wood, smoothing each corner like a sacred task. Lena planted herbs beside the porch, kneeling in damp soil, pressing life into the earth with the tips of her fingers. The ranch began to stretch again, like a bear waking from winter. Her father watched all this with the wary eye of a man who's seen storms bloom out of blue skies. He came to dinner now and then, said little but sat longer. He brought lumber one morning for Micah, gruffly muttering about fence repairs, though Micah had already built it twice over. Lena didn't press. Sometimes, a gift was shaped like a chore. And then came the day he gave her the quilt. It had been her mother's, a pattern of migrating geese stitched into sky-colored fabric. Caleb set it on the table without a word, then stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door swinging gently in his wake. Lena ran her fingers across the stitches. Some were neat, some jagged, like all the love that had raised her. That night, they laid the quilt on their bed, and Micah held her like she was still made of snow and needed guarding from melt. But it was Lena now who steadied him, who whispered, "We're here. We're rooted." Spring deepened. The ranch hummed. Chicks hatched. Cows birthed calves in tall grass. The foal Micah had saved now chased butterflies with legs too long for her body. And every evening, Lena wrote small notes in the old ledger by the kitchen window. Not about debts or feed costs, but about life. Micah's laugh, the way her father watched the porch swing when he thought she wasn't looking, the sudden craving for blackberries. But peace, Lena had learned, was not the same as stillness. One afternoon, she found Micah asleep in the barn, curled in the hay beside the unfinished cradle. The light fell across his face like honey, soft and golden. For a moment, she stood frozen, her hand resting against the doorframe, her heart catching. He looked just like he had that first morning, weathered, worn, mouth slightly parted, but this time he wasn't cold. He was home. And something about the image made her throat tighten. She stepped forward, careful not to wake him, and saw beside him a piece of carved wood, the headboard of the cradle, half finished, with her name etched into it in his quiet, deliberate hand. Lena. No flourish. No fuss. Just the truth of her, marked in grain. She sank beside him, and for a moment, the world was only breath and straw and the heartbeat of the child within her. Micah stirred, blinked sleepily, and smiled. Caught me. You build things even in your dreams? I build things so the dreams don't fall apart. She took his hand. I never thought I'd be part of someone's plans. You're not a part, he said. You're the reason. Later that evening, thunder began to roll in the distance. Low, slow, the kind that crawled along the horizon before showing its face. Lena stood on the porch, one hand on her stomach, the other resting on the railing. Micah joined her, a cup of warm tea in his hands, his eyes scanning the clouds. You feel that? He asked. Like something's coming. Storm. Change. Lightning flashed, far off. The wind picked up. Caleb appeared in the doorway behind them. You two better come inside. This one might be loud. It was. The rain came in sheets, slicing across the field, drumming against the roof with ancient rhythm. Lena stood at the window, watching it flood the yard, the troughs, the firewood stack. Micah came up behind her. It'll pass. She nodded. But something inside her coiled. Not fear. Anticipation. The next morning, the air was scrubbed clean. The sun rose bold and bright, and the ranch gleamed like it had been born again. Lena walked the land barefoot, letting the damp soil press into her soles. She passed the garden, the coop, the bunkhouse now used for storage. The barn stood open, sweet hay wafting out. She stepped inside, and paused. Her father stood there. He held the finished cradle in his hands. I added the last rail, he said. You left it out. She approached slowly. I didn't mean to. Wasn't a mistake, he said. You were waiting. She nodded. He set the cradle down, and they both stared at it. I didn't know how to be a father to a girl who didn't cry, he said. I thought strength meant silence. It doesn't, she replied. It means staying, even when silence hurts. He swallowed. I stayed for the land. I should have stayed for you. You still can. He looked at her belly, then into her eyes. You'll be better at this than I was. I learned by watching, she said, what not to do, and what still matters. Micah entered the barn then, saw them, and paused. Caleb straightened. For a breath, all three stood without speaking. Then Caleb stepped forward, extended his hand to Micah. Micah took it. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. Later that day, Lena moved the cradle into the house. She set it beside the window where the breeze brought the scent of wild sage and pine. She laid the quilt in it, smoothed the edges, and sat back with her hand over her belly. Outside, Micah hammered the final rail on the front gate. Her father worked the east field. The foal galloped in loose circles near the fence, and Granny Myrtle's laughter drifted down the road as she scolded her mule for lagging. Everything was ordinary, and somehow that made it holy. That night, Lena sat on the porch swing with Micah beside her, the stars burning above like scattered prayers. Do you think we'll be enough? She asked. We already are. She leaned her head on his shoulder. What if it gets hard again? Then we remember this. This. He gestured to the field, the stars, the quiet inside them. This peace. This root. This promise we didn't have to fight for because we built it together. She smiled, small and certain. Micah looked at her. You saved me, Lena. You were never lost, she said. Just waiting to be found in the right place. They sat long after the lanterns dimmed. And when the wind stirred the grass, soft and green again, it whispered through the land like a hymn. Spring had come while they slept. But they were awake now. Alive. And they were not afraid. Carmen Clark stood just outside the door, with shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her boots sunk ankle-deep in snow. She was not the sort of woman one noticed at first glance. There was nothing dramatic about her, no flash or fuss. But if you looked closer, at the angle of her jaw, the gentleness of her fingers, the quiet focus in her eyes, you might see a woman who had not only survived winter after winter, but learned how to build a life inside one. She watched the woods like someone expecting trouble, or perhaps just the past. A crow called from a bare branch, its cry raw in the cold. Carmen adjusted the scarf beneath her chin and stepped forward into the snow, dragging a small sled behind her. The firewood pile was low again. She hadn't expected her father to be gone so long this time. Jesse Clark left 4 days ago, saying he'd be back with coin and good whiskey, maybe even a new horse if things went right in Fort Hastings. Carmen had learned not to ask what those things were. She just nodded and kept her mouth still. She'd been good at that, keeping still. It was a skill she learned after her mother passed, after the preacher's son stopped coming by, after the women at church started speaking softer when she walked in. When her father turned to whiskey and wilder men, Carmen didn't shout or slam doors. She just tended the cabin, stitched the curtains, read books aloud to no one but the fire. She built her own kind of quiet. The snow was deeper past the fence line, tugging at her hem as she moved between the trees. She found a downed pine branch and bent to gather it, the cold biting through her gloves. It wasn't until she turned to drag the sled again that she saw the shape, dark, low, slumped in the white. It was far off at first, almost buried. A lump that didn't move like wood or rock. Carmen stared for a moment, breath catching in her throat. Then slowly, carefully, she stepped forward. The snow made sound vanish. Her boots crunched softly. The wind whistled through bare limbs. When she reached the figure, she dropped to one knee and brushed the snow away with gloved fingers. What she uncovered was a man. His skin was dark copper, his hair thick and tied back with leather. Blood had frozen along his temple. An arrow shaft jutted from his left shoulder, the feathers frayed and iced. His breath was shallow, but it was there, just a fragile fog against the cold air. Carmen's heart thudded. Comanche, her mind whispered. And the second thought came quicker, her father's voice, hard and cruel. If you see one, you shoot. Or you run. But she didn't move. She looked at the man again, truly looked, and saw the way his hand curled inward, as if trying to hold something he'd already lost. His face was young, carved with strength but not age. Blood smeared his lips. There was no weapon on him. He was dying. And if she left him here, he would not last an hour. Carmen stood, gaze flicking back toward her cabin. She was alone. No one would know. The right thing was dangerous. But wasn't everything else already dangerous too? She went back to the sled. The body was heavier than she expected, and every drag through the snow pulled something from her arms. But she didn't stop. She wrapped his torso in a quilt from the sled and wedged him in as best she could. The arrow jostled with each bump, and a low groan escaped his throat, but he didn't wake. The trip back to the cabin felt twice as long. Wind blew harder now, swirling flakes like ash. Carmen's boots slipped once on ice. She gritted her teeth and kept pulling. By the time she reached the porch, her breath burned. Her fingers had gone numb. She dragged him over the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. The fire popped in the hearth. Steam rose from the kettle. Carmen knelt beside the stranger and pulled back the quilt. Snow melted against the floorboards beneath him. She unwrapped the layers with care, revealing buckskin leggings, torn in places, and a chest that rose and fell in slow, shallow gulps. The arrow had broken off beneath the skin. Removing it would be cruel work. Carmen stood and crossed to the kitchen drawer. Her hands trembled as she gathered her sewing shears, cloth strips, a bottle of whiskey, and a small hunting knife. She returned to the man and sat beside him, speaking not to him, but to the room itself. "I don't know your name," she murmured, "but I reckon you didn't come here to die." She worked slowly, her breath catching each time he twitched or moaned. The arrow came free with a sick sound. Blood soaked the cloths. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and wrapped his shoulder with every strip of linen she had. Then she wiped his face with a warm rag. Beneath the blood and dirt, his features were striking, fierce and young. She didn't look long. When it was done, she dragged a spare mattress near the hearth and rolled him onto it. She tossed another log on the fire. The flames leapt. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. The storm was picking up. That night, she sat at the table and read from a tattered book of poems, her voice barely above a breath. She hadn't read aloud since her mother died. The man didn't stir. But at one point, as the wind shrieked past the eaves, she swore she saw his eyelids twitch. Just a flicker, like someone drifting toward light. Morning broke behind thick gray clouds, and the cabin felt wrapped in cotton. Carmen hadn't slept much. She stirred porridge over the fire and glanced often at the man. His breath came stronger now, steadier. The fever hadn't taken him. He woke before noon, eyes slitting open like someone trying to remember what world they were in. Carmen crouched beside him, bowl in hand. "You're safe," she said softly, unsure if he'd understand. He blinked. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then, rough and broken, a word. "Where?" "Near Red Willow," she replied. "You were in the snow. I found you." His eyes fluttered shut again. His hand twitched toward his shoulder, then dropped. "You shouldn't move. I got the arrow out, but you're still bleeding inside." He didn't speak again. Carmen rose, placed the bowl beside the fire, and watched him a while longer. A long red scar stretched from his collarbone to his chest, healed years ago. His hands were calloused but slender. Not a raider's hands. Not a killer's. She sat back down at the table and returned to her stitching. The rhythm steadied her. The needle moved through cloth like breath through prayer. She didn't know what came next. But she'd brought him in. And now he was hers to keep alive. Later that evening, as wind beat like fists against the shutters, she glanced at him again and found his eyes open. Dark, watchful, solemn. He didn't look afraid. He looked tired. As if he had known too many storms. They stared at each other for a long while. No words. Just breath and firelight. Then she said, quieter than before, "I don't expect you to trust me." He blinked once. "But I reckon you understand what it means to be left behind." Something in his gaze shifted. A softness beneath the pain. A small nod. Barely there. Carmen leaned back in her chair and let the fire warm her face. The storm howled on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. Not trust, not yet. But a thread had been drawn between them. Thin and new. A beginning. She didn't know that by the next night, 50 riders would come. That her father would be among them. That fire and blood waited just beyond the snow. But for now, in that fragile, flickering quiet, she watched over the stranger in the snow. And he, in his silence, let her. The storm lingered, sifting snow across the world in fine veils, as if the heavens themselves couldn't decide whether to let go or hold on. The cabin stood still in the wind, wood groaning softly under its weight. Inside, the fire kept a brave heart. It danced in the stone hearth, casting its light in slow golden pulses across floorboards, blankets, and the hollow-eyed man who lay curled close to it. Carmen sat across from him, knees drawn to her chest, mending a sock with quiet hands. The needle moved rhythmically, a whisper of silver through wool. It was not the work that kept her still, it was the nearness of him. He'd woken twice in the night, breathing hard, eyes darting. Each time, she rose and knelt beside him, Not speaking, not touching, just close enough to be felt. When he saw her face, he calmed. No words passed between them. But his fear didn't return. Now, as dawn tried and failed to press through the snowlight outside, Carmen studied him in secret. The Comanche man, still unnamed, had drifted back into sleep. His chest moved steadily beneath the rough wool she'd tucked around him. One arm rested on his stomach, the other across his brow, as if warding off dreams. The bandage she'd tied held. No fresh blood. No fever. He would live. But what then? She looked away and focused on the sock, fingers trembling only slightly. He wasn't safe here, not really. If her father returned, or if the neighbors noticed a second set of footprints outside the cabin. She closed her eyes for a moment. Let the fire's warmth press against her eyelids like a balm. When she opened them, he was watching her. She startled, just a breath, and then settled. His gaze was steady, unfearful, but filled with question. Not suspicion. Not accusation. Just the rawness of someone returned from the edge. "You're awake," she said softly. He blinked, but didn't answer. His lips were cracked. She set down the sock and rose to pour a ladle of warm water from the kettle. She crossed the floor with slow steps and crouched beside him, holding out the tin cup. He hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing hers. She noticed how careful his hands were, hands that could have been brutal, but weren't. He drank in small sips, eyes never leaving hers. When he was done, he handed the cup back, his hand lingering just a moment longer than needed. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with disuse. Carmen tucked the cup back onto the hearth shelf. "Do you have a name?" His mouth moved, unsure. Then he said, "Kumelu." She repeated it, tasting it softly. "Kumalu." He nodded once. Then his gaze flicked around the room, to the door, the windows, the stove. His hand moved toward his shoulder. "How long?" "2 days," she answered. "Since I brought you in." He processed that with a slow breath. Then looked back to her. "You no afraid?" "I was," she admitted. "Still am, a little." Kumalu's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something near understanding. He shifted slightly, winced, and settled back into the blankets. Carmen rose and fetched the porridge she'd left warming on the stove. She offered a bowl to him, then sat close again, eating her own. They didn't speak while they ate. But the silence was different now. Shared. Breathing the same air, warmed by the same fire. Afterward, she cleaned the bowls while he watched, his eyes tracking her movements like someone long used to danger, measuring every step, every motion. It wasn't distrust. It was caution layered over survival. Carmen didn't mind. She understood what it was to carry that kind of stillness. What it meant to guard yourself even while healing. She brought over a fresh cloth and sat beside him again, this time with her sewing scissors and a strip of linen. "I need to change the dressing." Kumalu gave a faint nod. She unwrapped the stained bandage with care, her hands gentle. The wound beneath was angry, but clean. As she pressed a damp cloth to it, he drew a sharp breath. His fingers gripped the edge of the blanket. "Sorry," she whispered. He closed his eyes. "You fix good." "I've had practice," she said, trimming a clean edge of linen. "My mother got sick when I was young. My father was not the gentle type." Kumalu didn't speak, but he opened his eyes again. They held a kind of quiet listening she wasn't used to. Most men heard only long enough to talk again. He wasn't like them. Carmen finished the bandage and sat back on her heels. "You should rest." "No. Help you. You can barely sit up." He shifted, tested the movement in his arm. It was limited, but he got halfway upright. She reached to steady him, and for a heartbeat, they were close, breath on breath, the fire casting flickers across their faces. "I chop wood," he offered. She blinked. "What? You cook? I help." Carmen shook her head, half amused, half stunned. "You've got a hole in your shoulder." He lifted his chin. "Still strong." He was serious. Eventually, she helped him to his feet. He was taller than she expected, lean but solid. His bare feet touched the floor with cautious strength. She handed him a wool coat, one that had belonged to her grandfather. It hung long on him, but covered what needed covering. They moved slowly through the snow to the woodpile. Carmen fetched the axe. Cumulu took it in his left hand, the good one, and raised it over the log. The first swing was crooked. The second hit better. The third split the wood. She watched, arms crossed, breath steaming in the cold. They worked like that for half an hour. He chopped. She stacked. The rhythm steadied them both. At one point, she handed him a piece and their hands met again. This time, neither pulled away too fast. Back inside, the fire burned hotter. The warmth sank deeper. That night, she gave him her mother's old Bible to use as a pillow and laid a second quilt across his chest. He watched her with those deep, still eyes, and before she turned away, he said, "Carmen." She turned, startled. "I hear you say it. To the fire." She hadn't known he was listening. Hadn't meant for him to. She gave a soft smile. "Yes, Carmen." He nodded once. "Carmen, you have good name," she whispered. "Yours too." They didn't say more. The fire cracked once. Then again. Snow beat soft rhythms against the roof. She returned to her corner chair, watching the flames with quiet thoughts crowding her chest. She remembered what her father said once, about Comanche men riding in the dark, cutting throats, burning fields. But the man sleeping in her home was nothing like the stories. He'd eaten her food with slow thanks. He'd chopped her wood with one good arm. He hadn't touched her. Hadn't even stepped close without being invited. Kindness didn't always look like safety, but it never looked like threat. She fell asleep without meaning to, the sound of the fire lulling her there. Sometime before dawn, she woke to the cabin still as a held breath. The fire had dimmed. Cumulu was still asleep. But outside, something moved. She rose, went to the window, pushed aside the curtain. A lone rider, silhouetted on the ridge. Watching. She didn't move. Just stood and watched back. After a moment, the rider turned and disappeared into the trees. She let the curtain fall. Went back to the fire. Saturday. Beside her, Cumulu stirred, sensing something unspoken. She didn't say what she saw. Not yet. But she looked at him with a new kind of fear coiling low in her gut. Not of him, but of what his presence had called into the world. Trouble was coming. The wind said so. Still, when she met his eyes again, she gave a nod. Small. Resolute. He was not alone anymore. And she was no longer hidden. Whatever came, they would face it between firelight and fear. Snow melted slowly as the storm withdrew its breath. The world outside the cabin was still white, but the wind had stilled, and the hush that followed was the hush of something gathering strength, not peace. Trees stood tall in frost-laced silence, branches burdened with ice like bowed heads in prayer. The river, half frozen, whispered beneath its shell. In that brittle quiet, the cabin's thin walls felt more like skin than shelter, each creak, each gust, a reminder of how near danger still sat. Inside, Cumulu moved with more confidence. His shoulder remained stiff, but the bleeding had stopped and the fever had passed. Carmen watched him from the hearth, her knitting forgotten in her lap. He stood by the window now, a blanket draped over his back like a mantle. Steam from the stew pot curled around his legs, but his eyes were fixed on the woods beyond the glass. "You think they'll come?" he said, not asking. She didn't answer right away. Her hands tightened slightly on the wool. "My father's not the sort to let things be." Cumulu turned his head just enough to meet her gaze. "How long?" "A day. Maybe less." She swallowed. They'd have to wait out the worst of the snow. But he'll bring others. He won't come alone. Cumulu nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. Then he turned back to the window. "I should go." "No," she said too quickly, standing. "You wouldn't make it far." Not like this. He looked at her with quiet patience. If I stay, your house burns. That may happen anyway. Her voice had a new steel in it. She was tired of fear scratching at her like a stray dog. For too long she'd lived under her father's shadow, his anger, his rules, his endless threats dressed as advice. He'd once said she was too soft to survive on her own. That women like her needed men like him to keep them upright. She had believed him once. She didn't anymore. Cumulus stepped back from the window, slowly, carefully, as though some thread had been pulled taut between them and he didn't want it to snap. You saved me, he said. Carmen met his eyes. You weren't mine to leave. That night, they spoke more than they had in days. She asked where he'd come from, and he told her, not all at once, but in pieces, like someone unwrapping a wound. He spoke of his brother, slain on the edge of white men's land, of his uncle's warnings not to cross too far east, of hunger, of watching the bison vanish. He was no raider, no thief. He had been hunting. And then he had been hunted. Carmen listened, each word stitching something inside her back together. Not because his story matched hers, it didn't, but because it held the same undercurrent, loss that couldn't be undone. She told him of her mother, of the long sickness, of how her father had turned sharp afterward, blaming Carmen for things that weren't hers to carry, how her fiancé had left not with rage, but with pity in his eyes, which somehow cut deeper. They shared those stories not with grief, but with recognition. That evening, Carmen brought out a small black-bound book, her mother's journal, filled with half-thoughts and pressed flowers. She read a few lines aloud, and Cumulus listened with his head tilted, catching the rhythm more than the meaning. Later, he said softly, words you carry, they are like fire, quiet, but warm. Carmen smiled faintly. They're all I have. He didn't correct her. But when he reached toward the mantel and set a pine cone in her lap, a perfect one, dry and symmetrical, she understood what he meant, that maybe she had more than she thought. They spent the next morning reinforcing the shutters and dragging buckets of water close to the hearth. Carmen mixed lye and ash to make soap, her sleeves rolled up and her braid tucked tight. Cumulus fashioned a rough spear from a broken tool handle and the tip of an old carving knife. No plans were made for a fight. Only preparations for not being helpless. In the late afternoon, as the light tilted gold across the snow, Carmen noticed something strange, stillness so profound it rang in her ears. She stood by the doorway, watching the trees. Birds had stopped calling. Even the wind had gone quiet. And then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Distant, but many. Like thunder with discipline. She turned. Cumulus was already at the window. How many? She asked, her voice brittle. He hesitated. 20. No more. Her mouth dried. My father doesn't come light. Cumulus' grip tightened around the spear. By the time the riders came into view, the sun was sinking, and the horizon glowed with the blood-orange hue of evening. They approached like a storm on horseback, kicking up snow and frozen mud. At their center rode Jesse Clark, broad-shouldered, whiskey-eyed, with his long coat flapping and his revolver slung low. He didn't look like a father. He looked like a man who'd convinced himself the world owed him something, and he'd come to collect. Carmen opened the cellar door. It creaked. Go, she whispered. Now. Cumulus hesitated at the top of the steps. They'll burn it. She looked at him with a fierceness he hadn't yet seen in her. I won't let them. I can fight. I know. But I don't need you to fight. I need you to live. His eyes searched hers, but he said no more. He descended into the dark. She shut the door and rolled the rug over it. The cabin returned to silence. Outside, the riders dismounted, boots crunching over ice and wood. Carmen stepped out onto the porch, her shotgun unprimed in her hands. She held it not as a threat, but as a statement. This is mine. Jesse saw her and sneered. So it's true. You're sheltering him. Carmen stood straight. I found a man near dead in the snow. I did what any human being should have done. Human. Jesse barked a laugh. You forget what they did to your uncle? That wasn't him. They're all the same. No, Carmen said, louder now. They're not. The men shifted. Some looked toward Jesse. Others glanced at each other. No one raised a gun. Carmen took a step forward. He's not a raider. He didn't steal. He didn't kill. He's a man. Hurt. Alone. And I saved him. Traitor, Jesse spat. You'd side with them over your blood? Carmen raised the shotgun, not at him, but toward the air. Don't make this about blood. You stopped being family when you brought outlaws into our home. One of the men, young, maybe 17, lowered his rifle. Carmen recognized him. She'd taught him his letters at Sunday school once, years ago, when his face still held the roundness of boyhood. She's telling the truth, he said. His voice cracked. I seen her chop firewood through blizzards. Ain't no liar. Jesse turned on him. You shut your mouth. Another man stepped forward. Then another. Uncertain murmurs rose. Carmen's hands didn't shake. She stepped down from the porch and stood between the cabin and her father. I won't move, she said. If you want to shoot him, you go through me. The wind stirred, cold and thin. For a moment, Jesse stared at her as if he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Then, with a low snarl, he drew his revolver and pointed it, not at her heart, but at the floorboards. The cellar. He cocked the hammer. Carmen braced. A shot rang out. But it wasn't from Jesse. His leg buckled, a bloom of red soaking through his pant leg. He screamed, collapsing into the snow. The man who'd fired stood a few paces back, rifle raised. He didn't look like a hero. Just tired. Enough, he said. This ain't justice. This is slaughter. The other men stood still. No one helped Jesse. His curses turned to wheezing as the cold bit into his blood. Carmen didn't speak. She stepped forward, took Jesse's pistol from his hand, and tossed it into the snowbank. He reached for her, but she stepped away. Go, she said, voice low. They left him there. Not all at once, but slowly, one by one, the riders turned their horses and melted into the trees. The ones who stayed behind helped Jesse to his feet. He didn't look at her again. When it was over, and the wind had calmed again, Carmen went back into the house. She rolled back the rug, opened the cellar door. Cumulus stood there in the shadows, eyes wide, body ready. It's done, she whispered. He climbed the steps, face drawn. For a long moment, they just stood there, breathing the same space, hearts thudding in time. You didn't run, he said finally. I said I wouldn't. You stood alone. She shook her head. Not alone. He reached for her hand. Held it, warm and firm. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Not with fury this time, but gently. As though the sky, having watched it all, had decided to start again. Carmen didn't know what came next. The days ahead would be hard, and the land would remember what had been done here. But for now, she stood in a cabin she had chosen to defend, beside a man who had not asked to be saved, and yet had been. And that was something like hope. The air the next morning held a bitterness that went beyond cold. It wasn't just winter stretching its claws across the land. It was the tension of something unfinished, the way a held breath trembles before it shatters. The snow around the cabin bore the ghosts of boot prints, wheels, blood. Wind had tried to cover them overnight, but some things could not be buried. Inside, Carmen stirred the ashes in the hearth with quiet hands. The fire had gone out hours before, but she let her fingers sift the remains anyway. Her shawl hung loose over her shoulders. She hadn't slept, not truly. She hadn't even changed from the day before. The cabin smelled of cold iron and wood smoke, and something else, something sour, like sweat born of fear. Cumulus moved in the kitchen behind her, grinding coffee beans with deliberate rhythm. He said nothing. They hadn't spoken much since the riders left. It wasn't silence born of awkwardness. It was the silence of people who had stood on the edge of something irreversible and come back changed. Outside, the world looked untouched. But inside, they were carrying everything. Carmen rose and poured water into the pot, then crossed to the window. Frost crept along the glass, framing the trees in lace. She watched them with narrowed eyes, her breath fogging the pain. "They'll come back," she said quietly. Cumuloo didn't turn from the grindstone. "Yes." She wrapped her arms around herself, the chill deeper than skin. "Maybe not all of them, but some. My father won't forget. He won't forgive. He's wounded," Cumuloo said. "And angry." He nodded, eyes fixed on the motion of his hands. "Angry men come back harder. Meaner." The truth settled between them, as warm and welcome as stone. She stepped away from the window and sat at the table. Her hands curled around an empty mug. "They know I stood between him and you. That I lied. That I dared to say no." Cumuloo glanced at her. "You didn't lie. You told the truth they didn't want. I stood in the open and made myself a target. You always were one," he said gently. "But now you have a name. Now you have fire." She didn't respond, but her eyes held his. They understood each other now in a way that couldn't be explained, only felt like a wound that had stopped bleeding but still pulsed in memory. The day passed without visitors, but the feeling of being watched never left. Shadows moved behind trees too quickly. Birds lifted from branches as if stirred by footsteps no one could hear. Cumuloo sat outside with his spear across his lap, eyes tracing the line of the horizon. Carmen stayed in the doorway, mending shirts, her rifle leaning within reach. At dusk, smoke rose on the far ridge. She stood, heart-locking. Cumuloo followed her gaze. A second plume rose beside it. Then a third. "They're burning fields," she whispered. He shook his head. "No. They're circling, marking ground, letting you know." Her lips parted but no sound came. She could taste the message in the sky. "We're coming. We won't shout this time. We'll whisper with flame." The night pressed close. They didn't sleep. Carmen boiled beans and salted pork. Cumuloo oiled the hunting knife and wrapped it in leather. They didn't talk about what would happen next. They prepared for it. Near midnight, the sound of a distant scream echoed through the trees. Not a human one. An animal. Maybe a horse. Maybe not. Carmen flinched. Cumuloo moved to the door without a word, peering into the blackness. He came back with a firm jaw. 3 riders. Watching. She nodded. "They'll wait for light." He sat across from her at the table. The fire between them burned low. Shadows crept up the walls. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed away?" she asked suddenly. Cumuloo studied her. "From here. From me. No. Even with this coming?" He looked down at his hands. They were scarred, blunt-fingered, worn from years of bowstrings and building fires. "You saved me. I didn't know the shape of that until now." She looked away. "I don't want you to die for it," she whispered. "I don't want you to die alone." The words sat heavy, then softened. Before dawn, the smoke had thickened. The world turned gray-blue, as if even the sun had hesitated to rise. Snow crunched in the distance, hooves again, but slower this time. Measured. Not a charge. A warning. They came not with 50, but 15. And this time, Jesse rode in silence. His leg was wrapped in cloth, blood crusted against his pants, but he sat high in the saddle, his face grim with fury held on a leash. The men behind him looked harder than before, older, quieter. Their faces gave nothing. Their rifles gave everything. Carmen stood on the porch again, but this time without the shotgun. Cumuloo stood beside her, shoulder bandaged beneath his coat, the spear slung across his back. Jesse dismounted slowly. He walked with a limp. Snow fell off his boot in chunks. He stopped 5 paces from her, breathing hard. "You ready to pay for what you've done?" he asked low. "I've already paid," Carmen replied. "And I'm not giving you another piece. You sheltered a killer." "No. I sheltered a man you tried to kill. He's a savage. He's kinder than you've ever been. Jesse's jaw tightened. You think you're better than me now? I know I am. He pulled his pistol. Cumuloo moved, one step forward, hand tight around the haft of the spear. The men behind Jesse didn't draw yet. They were watching, measuring. You gonna fight for her, Red Man? Jesse sneered. You think she loves you? You're just her rebellion. Cumuloo didn't answer. Carmen did. I'd die before I let you make me small again. Her voice rang out, sharp and strange in the stillness. Jesse's hand twitched. He aimed. But the shot never came. Because from the trees behind them, another voice called out, firm, tired, cracked like dry leather. Enough. The boy from before stepped out. Now he wore his father's coat. The rifle in his hands didn't shake. She saved my brother once, when he broke his leg fallin' off a wagon. Brought him bread for a week, till we could fetch a doctor. That don't sound like no traitor. Carmen blinked. One of the older riders lowered his gun. Then another. The silence shifted. Jesse turned, eyes wild. You gutless fools. He didn't finish. Because Carmen stepped off the porch. And Cumuloo followed her. She stood before Jesse now, close enough to see the tremble in his hands. You raised me to fear everything that wasn't you, she said. You made kindness sound weak. But it's the strongest thing I've got. Jesse snarled. You're just like your mother. Carmen smiled. I hope so. His hand moved again, but not fast enough. The boy's rifle barked. The shot struck the snow beside Jesse's foot. He stumbled back, eyes wide. No one moved to help him. No one stood beside him anymore. Jesse turned and limped toward his horse. He climbed into the saddle without a word. His men didn't follow. They stayed behind. One by one, they turned to Carmen. One by one, they nodded. And then they left, on foot, on horseback, into the woods, into the morning light. When it was over, Carmen stood in the snow, trembling, breath short. The fire inside her hadn't gone out, but it had burned through too much. Cumuloo touched her shoulder. You did that, he said. She shook her head. We did. They stood together as the sun finally breached the trees, light striking the snow like golden ash. Smoke still rose in the distance, but not from her home. The cabin stood. The fire lived. And for the first time, Carmen breathed without bracing. Whatever came next would come. But now, she stood free in the open. Unburned. Unbroken. The wind had changed. It no longer screamed or whispered. It moved like a hush after a storm, trailing over the prairie with the weight of what had been witnessed. Snow melted slow in the fields, revealing the broken shapes beneath. Churned earth, hoof tracks, scattered embers, and a bent spoon Carmen had dropped days ago and forgotten. The sun broke the clouds in slanted golds, not warm exactly, but honest. Like something new could begin, if you dared to let it. Carmen stood in the doorway, arms crossed beneath her shawl. The cabin behind her bore the marks of fire and men, the scorched porch edge, the cracked window pane, the quiet where old noise used to be. But it still stood. So did she. Cumuloo sat on the steps, sharpening the blade he'd remade from scrap and stone, the whetstone hissing against metal in steady, thoughtful rhythm. His shoulder was healing. The stiffness had eased, though he still favored the other arm when lifting wood or reins. He hadn't spoken much since the last ride left. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of what had been proven. Carmen watched the sky while he worked. Each night she expected the fear to return. The ache. The old tremble in her ribs when a door slammed or a voice rose. But it hadn't come. Not like before. There was grief, yes. For the girl who had cowered. For the years she'd given over to pleasing ghosts. But no fear. She had looked her father in the eye and said no. She had stood still while rifles were drawn. And she had not shattered. What are you thinking? Cumuloo asked, not looking up. Carmen exhaled. Slow. I'm thinking this house has stood longer than I thought it could. He nodded. like its keeper. She smiled, faint and full of meaning, then stepped off the porch, boots crunching on thawing snow. She walked toward the tree line, where the river twisted behind bare cottonwoods. Cumuloo rose and followed her, the knife now sheathed at his side. They moved in tandem, unhurried, like the land around them. When they reached the river, she crouched and let her fingers skim the surface. The water was cold, fast, and pure. The same river that nearly iced over when she found him was running free again. She stood and looked at him. "I used to come here when I was little," she said. "When he yelled. When I couldn't breathe inside that house. I'd sit right there under the roots and pretend I lived somewhere else." Cumuloo followed her gaze, to the crooked tree where roots jutted like fingers gripping the bank. "You lived," he said. "I did." A silence passed between them, but not one they feared. Cumuloo stepped closer. "I go home soon." She didn't look away. "I know. My people, they'll want to see me, to know I'm alive. And I must tell them what happened." Carmen nodded. "You should. They'll want the truth." He hesitated. "I will return." She studied his face. Not the words, but the space between them. There was no promise he didn't mean, no dream painted in pretty colors. Just the steady, earthy truth of it. "I will return." And in her heart, she believed it. That night, they sat by the fire. Not in their old places across the room, but side by side, their shoulders touching. She read softly from her mother's journal, the same passage she'd once read aloud to the silence. He listened, his eyes half closed, lips just parted, like he was hearing music. When she finished, he said, "Your mother saw the world with brave eyes. She never taught me to hate, only to notice. You notice everything. I try." Later, she brought out a roll of cloth, her mother's final quilt, half-stitched, the corners fraying from years of waiting. She set it in his lap. "Take it with you. Finish it. If you come back, bring it." He touched the fabric like it was sacred. "I will." He left 2 days later, at first light. Carmen stood in the doorway again, watching him ride off into the snow-fringed trees, his back straight, his horse quiet beneath him. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. She watched until he vanished. Then she closed the door and wept, not because he was gone, but because someone had finally seen her and stayed long enough to matter. Spring came in steps. The river ran wide, swollen from melt. Birds returned to the eaves. The land thawed and softened, and with it, Carmen did too. She planted onions and cabbage, repaired the chicken coop, rode into town with her chin high and her eyes steady. The women who once called her plain now watched her with quiet curiosity. She didn't explain herself. Didn't need to. She was still alone, yes, but not lonely. She read more now, wrote lines of her own. Some nights she sang old lullabies in a voice low and sure. The cabin changed, too. The burn marks faded beneath her hands. New curtains. A patched roof. A peace that didn't need permission. One day, in late May, a rider came down the trail. Carmen was weeding carrots and didn't look up right away. When she did, the sun caught the figure, painting it gold. Her breath caught. Cumuloo dismounted without a word. He carried a cloth bundle in one hand. He knelt and unrolled it before her. The quilt, finished now, each patch sewn with careful strength. A circle of red thread bound the center. "I told you I would," he said. Carmen wiped her hands and touched the stitches. "You remembered the red circle." "It means return," he said. "In our way." She reached for his hand, held it. That night, they laid the quilt across the bed and slept beneath it, not as strangers, not as visitors, but as two people who had chosen each other through fire, silence, fear, and thaw. The world outside still held danger. The scars still ached when rain came. But the fire between them never burned what it could warm. And when they woke with the dawn brushing gold across the floor, Carmen whispered, "You're home." Cumuloo turned to her, and in his eyes she saw no hesitation. "Yes," he said. So are you. What fire doesn't burn, it strengthens. And what survives it becomes something holy.